Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s, everybody. I'm with Glenn Greenberg today. Glenn joined me last year when he did the bookazine on McCartney turning 80. And he's got a new one out now called The Trivia Book of the Beatles. And Glenn, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be back. I love this show.
I didn't think you'd be back this soon. You write pretty fast.
I try. I have to.
Got to put food on the table, huh? Well,
Deadlines, deadlines.
one of the things I was not expecting a trivia book on the Beatles, and I know you've worked on several Beatle projects. You've been busy. You've turned down a couple others, and then this one came up. Why don't you just give us a background of some of the work you've done just recently?
Well, recently I've done this is my third Beatles related book. I did for the 80th birthday of John Lennon. I did an entire bookazine devoted to him. For Paul's 80th, I did a similar publication for Time. It was called Time Special Edition, Paul McCartney at 80. And for both books, they completely ran through their entire lives, their careers. They're kind of like primers for newcomers or people who vaguely know the Beatles and solo stories, but want to get a little bit more meat. And I try to throw in some cool stuff for the hardcores too.
Mhm.
A little bit something for everybody. And so, but I've done other topics as well. I've dabbled in Marvel, Spider-Man, Star Wars, Star Trek. But basically, I get to write about all of my passions with these things. And the Beatles is safe to say a lifelong passion. I mean, ever since I was like 7 or 8 years old. So this one is a little bit different because it's particularly formatted with it's a Q&A. The whole book is a Q&A. But the A's we get to get into a little bit of depth, which is fun. It's not just a quiz book with multiple choice questions and multiple possible answers. It's an interesting format, and I had a lot of fun doing it.
Well, the format I thought was excellent. I mean, I didn't really know what to expect. And first of all, as a designer, I thought the design was really top notch.
Yeah.
It looks really professional, very slick. And I like how it's told in a bit of a chronology. I would have never thought to do it this way, but it's broken into some different sections. Why don't you explain the sections it's broken
Sure.
into?
Yeah. It's 9 chapters and 9 questions for each chapter. And the way it's broken down is by era. And I think it's something that my editor, Bob Durr, and I kind of came to simultaneously because when we sat down and kind of mapped it out, I think we both kind of came to it with the same idea, which was if it's going to be 9 chapters with that kind of breakdown, break it down into the eras of the Beatles first and foremost. So you've got the early years, you've got Beatlemania, you've got the studio years, and you've got the final years. So those are 4 eras. Then you can go a little bit deeper and give a chapter to each Beatle. Make sure that you don't ask anything in the Beatles chapters that you might want to ask in the solo chapters, so that you can cover more ground. So obviously there's a chapter each about John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Well, that brings you to 8 chapters. And so the last chapter focused solely on the solo careers, the solo years. Whereas the individual chapters for each guy can be about anything, their personal lives, their time with the Beatles, their time after the Beatles. But the solo years stuff focuses specifically on the accomplishments or work that were done in the solo years. And that's how we broke it down.
Okay, well, what were some of the challenges you had with just deciding the questions? I mean, it's such a wide, such a wide scope.
That was the challenge. That really was the challenge. Um, you can really you could freeze up trying to address the entire Beatles history and figure out, oh my God, where do I even begin? So you have to sort of get past that and just think about, okay, who is our audience, or who is our intended audience? And the audience that I try to focus this on, and all of the other bookazines that I've written about the Beatles, is everybody. A little bit for the newcomers, a little bit for the casual fan, and a little bit for the diehards.
Mhm.
So the way I broke it down is what is need to know versus nice to know, and just try to get as much of that in as possible. So the way I broke it down with my editor was, and again, it's 9 questions per chapter. So for each chapter, the way I worked it out with him was, I would send him more than 9 questions to get approved. So I'd send him like, say, 12 or 13 questions. So this way, he has more than he needs. He can choose the ones that he likes the most, the best ones. If I only sent him 9 and he ended up liking maybe 6, well, then I have to go back and write 3 more. So this way, it's all done ahead of time. And so he would choose what he felt were the best 9. If I had any concerns about it, we have that kind of relationship where I can call him up and say, hey, how about this one instead? And that's basically how we broke it down. We're pretty simpatico in terms of our Beatles knowledge and how we see the Beatles and how we want to cover the Beatles. So it was fairly fairly easy in terms of, there wasn't a lot of back and forth. There wasn't a lot of pushback. In fact, I was actually kind of excited about the stuff that I thought was so off the wall that, that would get rejected, or the stuff that I thought was such a surefire thing that didn't get in favor of the more off the wall stuff.
Well, your editor must be a Beatle fan, right?
Yeah, he's very, very knowledgeable. In fact, the cool thing was, when we worked on the John Lennon book together, there were some editorial changes that he made that I kind of questioned, because I saw, well, to get into a little bit of detail, just in terms of how much of a negative impact Yoko Ono's presence had on the Beatles or John Lennon. And I came from it from a very specific standpoint, and Bob had a different standpoint. So there were some edits that were made, and I was like, well, but I want to say this, So we got on the phone, and when we talked for a little while, and I could see that he had the same level of knowledge that I did, and it was really 2 people looking at the same set of facts and just having a different outlook on it. And so what I came to the realization was his outlook wasn't any less valid than mine, because it was based on the same set of facts. And so I was like, yeah, I can't really, I disagree. I have a different gut level reaction to these facts, but it doesn't mean that I'm right and he's wrong. So I had to sort of, and that's the degree of respect, and so, yeah, so he's very well knowledgeable about the Beatles. Very well knowledgeable.
Yeah, I find myself having the same problem occasionally, where I'm looking at the facts and I interpret those facts in a certain way. Then somebody will say, well, why? I interpret it this way. And how about this? Well, you know what? I never thought of it that way. But I mean, that's the fun of it. I think is to take the facts and interpret them. And that'll keep people busy for a good long time.
Absolutely. And it's and it's one of those things. I've worked with a lot of editors over the years, and it's like, sometimes when your work is edited, and either you take it personally, or you steam about it, or you stew about it for years and years and years. And that's happened with me and some of the stuff that I've worked on. But in this regard, because I did respect where he was coming from, and he did present it in such a way that, yeah, I could see where he would have that outlook on it. And that's really important. And it's great when the editor and the writer can disagree, but still come away from it with a lot of respect. And even though one has to win and one has to lose, the loser doesn't necessarily feel bad about it. Doesn't feel like they lost, Yeah,
it's a good way to put it, because that's what I try to do, because I get a lot of commenters on this channel, and there's a lot of people that contribute, and you try to just approach it in a way that is respectful. And sometimes it's not respectful, but you try your best to respect the person's position.
Hmm.
So long as they're approaching the position honestly.
Yeah.
And that's really the key. If you check the ego at the door, say, well, let's have another look at this. That's typically where you're always going to get uh, a nice agreement or a nice disagreement, if you will, and where both people walk away satisfied.
Yeah, and it's not like this is such a topic that hasn't been debated for 50 years at this point. You know,
Right.
it's an age-old topic at this point, and it's ongoing in terms of whether or not Yoko was a positive impact on John Lennon's life, whether she broke up the Beatles or not, all that kind of stuff. And so it's never been resolved. So having two people today, a writer and an editor, sort of having different viewpoints on it is nothing new, and it's par for the course.
Exactly. And it's interesting how when you first told me you were doing this trivia book, I thought, wow, that really surprised me. I didn't expect that at all.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, how would you do it? But after reading it, it's one of these publications that I think really brings in new fans and people that know the Beatles even casually. I think it can hook them in. And as I said, it's really a sharp book.
It's a
It's a
great thing.
bookazine, technically. But I think that's really something that I'm not sure if people are trying to do that as much is to bring in new fans. It seems like most of what is being produced for the Beatle fans now is for us older fans.
Yeah.
And obviously we've got the history, we can typically afford maybe a box set or something.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure what they're gearing up for younger generations, but this seems to be it. This is one of those things I think will speak to them.
There's that. I mean, I was actually walking past a store in New York City last weekend, and it was filled with Beatles merchandise aimed at like kids, like socks,
Really?
and little T-shirts and stuff like that. So, I mean, they're really aiming young in that regard. And if this is something that like maybe this is like the next intermediate step into creating new Beatles fans, I'd be thrilled.
Yeah, I mean, we've got box sets coming out every year now. I've heard
Hmm.
that they're going to do Rubber Soul here in 2023.
That's
And
amazing.
it seems like, I mean, I guess they could do two box sets per year and we'd still buy them. I'm not quite sure. I mean, we're coming down, we're whittling down to, I mean, maybe some albums won't get the box set treatment. I don't know. Would Yellow Submarine? I don't know. But there's ways you could do it. I mean,
Sure.
there's very few bands that, almost no bands that would really constitute a box set for every album.
Right.
Beatles would be one of those. But yeah, it's really interesting to see how the Beatles keep getting sold to us and resold to us, and some in new ways, like this here, and some old ways as well. And we just keep
Hmm.
buying stuff. But I mean, there's usually new stuff with it. I keep finding new things like the Revolver box set. There was some new things in some of those
Yeah.
outtakes that I would really surprise me, and I was pleasantly surprised. And it's just fun to hear the process.
Yeah, I got the Revolver box set. I haven't listened to it yet because I've been too busy listening to another Beatles album for the next Beatles bookazine project that I'm working on. I've been
Hmm.
doing a deep dive into another certain album. Um, and so I've been focusing on that, the box set for that one. But as soon as I'm over the hill on the project that I'm working on now, I plan to do a deep dive into the Revolver box, and I'm really looking forward to that. Um, but yeah, it's I mean between the Peter Jackson documentary. I mean, and that's the other thing is with all of these um Beatles projects that I work on. I mean, I have a pretty extensive Beatles library in my home,
Hmm.
and I've got all of the books that you would expect a Beatles fan and a Beatles student. I wouldn't call myself a scholar, but certainly a Beatles wannabe scholar or
Hmm.
expert would have. And a lot of those books are like 10, 15, 20 years old. So one of the other things that I really try to do is be as current as I possibly can. So I try to reflect the Peter Jackson documentary or whatever new information surfaces, the box sets, in some way, shape, or form gives us new information, new material.
Hmm.
So I always try to incorporate that so that people can see, a reference to 2021 or 2022 rather than just 1965 or 66.
It is amazing all the new stuff that we are finding out about these guys. Occasionally there'll be some pictures that surface
Mm-hmm.
or an interview or all this cool stuff. And I know people are waiting for Mark Lewison's volume 2. And I saw on Twitter today, somebody tweeted that there might be an announcement at Beatle Fest in England. That must be in London or
Okay.
whatever it's called, Fest for Beatle fans. They can't use Beatle Fest. I don't know. But anyway, maybe he's going to announce when the book will be released, which will probably be about this time next year, is my guess. But
Mm-hmm.
so the reason I bring him up is by him diving into all this paperwork and contracts and things like that, that typically interviewers would never ask. This is hard evidence of their existence and now the business dealings they had, and it really gives a lot more uh, meat on the bone to the story.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that I always look forward to his stuff. And just like these outtakes on these box sets. I mean, wow, this is really interesting how they used a different instrument there. Or like, I think most people found that the song Yellow Submarine, where John Lennon is singing these different lyrics, he kind of started that whole thing,
Yeah.
and which was not really known. So those are great little discoveries. It's like discovering new Beatles stuff is what it's like a
Absolutely.
new release. It's the closest we'll get.
And there's that, but there's also a lot of things that people have forgotten. And it's both a blessing and a curse, is that for the stuff that I'm really interested in, my mind is like a steel trap. It may be difficult to find some of that stuff, but I find that if you dig deep enough, you can find it. Like, wait, that thing that I knew about 35 years ago, where can I find, where can I scour whether it's going through 45 years worth of Rolling Stone to look for the one line in the one George Harrison interview that I remember reading when I was in, junior high school,
Yeah.
or just the fact that, I don't know how many people remember, which Beatle hosted Saturday Night Live. Three of them appeared on it, but which one hosted it? People
Hmm.
might not remember at this point. I remember this stuff, and as long as I can prove it, as long as I've got the receipts to say, okay, here it is, it's valid to become a question, and that's part of the approach that I took to asking some of these questions. I mean, I guess we could talk about, I don't want to give the whole thing away, but
Hmm.
there's one of the questions is, on when did Ringo actually play the drums on back in the USSR? Because it's common knowledge, if you're a Beatles fan, that he didn't play drums on the original recording because he quit the band while they were recording it. So he did get to play it at one point. When and with who? And I happen to remember that because, I'm a Beatles fan since
Hmm.
1977. And so that became one of the questions. And
Yes,
I
and
was able to, yeah,
I do remember that as well. And that was a fun question to come across.
great. Yeah, it was, and it was fun. It was fun to, again, find the receipt, because it's out there. You can actually see it happen, um, thanks to YouTube. Bless YouTube. That's what it's good for.
Yeah, I
For
love
helping
YouTube.
me.
Yeah, it's
So yeah,
amazing. It's amazing how much obscure stuff is on YouTube. It's almost like the more obscure the song, the easier it is to find it, because that's
I-
it. There's like it's like collectors want to get it out to us. They want
yeah,
to. It's like almost like a contest to get the most obscure stuff out,
yeah.
and it's just an amazing time to be able to collect information.
For the more obscure stuff, I did try to be a little bit more off the wall, and that would balance out, the typical question like, who was the drummer before Ringo? I mean, that's kind of like it's a
Right.
gimme. I mean, that's
Hmm.
that's kind of has to be in there, but you know, when and where did Ringo play back in the USSR? Finally, uh, I I dare the casual Beatles fan to have even known to ask that question, let
Yeah,
alone
that
answer it.
yeah, that's kind of that's a tricky one, but that's a good one. It's a good one.
Thanks. So yes.
So what now that you've done several Beatle projects, is there anything that your dream Beatle project to write? I know you've got one coming up here that you're going to probably wait on telling us about, but
A little bit. Yeah.
anything else that you would, any topics that you feel, or even if you'd want to see somebody else write it, what topics do you think need to be served more?
Well, I was thinking about it, and I would love to have the resources and the materials to be able to answer it. But the topic that I would love to cover is the 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 greatest unsolved mysteries of the Beatles.
Hmm.
And there are some. Off the top of my head, it's the way that the Let It Be sessions just kind of petered out, and the way that the whole entrance of Alan Klein into the picture, and the way they were squabbling, and just how nasty it was getting. Um, how the hell did they agree to do Abbey Road? How did they get it back together to do Abbey Road? Because the myth that came up is, well, they decided that they're going to pack it in, so they might as well go out on a high note. We know now that's not the case, because after Abbey Road, they had a meeting to discuss what are we going to do next.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out the answer was nothing. The answer was break up.
Yeah.
But they didn't go into Abbey Road knowing this was going to be the end. So my question was, why was Let It Be not the end?
Yeah.
Especially as the relationships disintegrated. When Paul called George Martin and said, "We want to do another album. Will you produce it?" What I want to know is, how did they get from step A to step C?
Yeah.
Step A is the end of Let It Be. Step C is calling George Martin. What was step B? How did they get that back together? I'd love to know that. I'd love to know if they ever talked about, well, John is digging in his heels for Alan Klein. Paul is digging in his heels for the Eastmans. Did they ever talk about another alternative?
Yeah,
Uh,
that would have been, I mean, once you come to an impasse and it seems like nobody's going to budge, I mean, there was no reason why you couldn't find any other number of people that could manage you, or have a couple different managers that specialize in different parts of management to handle different parts, because the Beatles were a big thing. I mean, for a while there, Klein and the Eastmans were kind of divvying it
doing
up,
that. Yeah.
and that, so I can imagine in a better world, Klein comes in and negotiates contracts and royalty rates, and the Eastmans are more the lawyers who dot the I's and cross the T's. It's by the time the Beatles broke up, or what during the breakup in the early 70s, they employed like 5 different law firms in both London and New York. I mean, it was unbelievable the amount of legal teams that were needed to sort that out. So, I mean, just to run the Beatles, having a couple of different people would have made sense. But yeah,
Right.
you're right. That's a good one. And that one, maybe they never even thought of it much themselves. They were too caught
And
up in their own thing.
right. And of course, the other great unsolved mystery is what happened between John and Brian in Spain in 60, was it 62 or
63,
63?
I think. Yeah.
63. That's one of the things that I thought about touching upon it in this book, and I decided, nah, it's too much of a hot potato, and especially because you can't get at the definitive answer. um you know I only found out recently what Hunter Davies claimed, what Pete Shotton claimed, was that,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, Brian and John definitely had a fling. But you have a whole raft of other sources that say no. And it's not because I've got like this, insatiable curiosity, and I need to know. It's one of the Beatles mysteries. It's something that's been lingering for years, that people have speculated about, talked about for years. So I count it as one of the great unsolved Beatles mysteries.
Yeah, that's one that doesn't get talked about too much. and the aftermath of John getting drunk at Paul's 21st birthday party and hitting
Beating
Bob
up.
Wooler and all
Yeah.
that, which is connected to that.
Hmm.
And, it's just one of those parts of the story. We can't possibly know everything.
Right.
Although, the trip to Spain we had to, that people were raising an eyebrow to that because I think it was 2 weeks. It wasn't like a weekend.
N-
And,
Yeah.
so anyway, he's going to get razzed. It's like, come on. I mean, he just hit a drunk guy who was smaller than him, basically.
Right.
So yeah, that's an interesting one. But it
And
seems
his
like nothing really came of it.
Right, right. Except, probably Brian fell even hard. I mean, if it's true, I would imagine that Brian fell even harder for John, and maybe that's what added to what maybe that's what fueled his depression. Is coming so close and not being able to have an ongoing relationship with him in that way. So I mean, it's all
Yeah.
speculation, but
Yeah. I mean, I think Brian Epstein is one of those people that we could use a little bit more clarity on just in general. And some people think that he was murdered and all this stuff.
yeah.
And it always goes to that direction, but he was in pretty bad shape in that last year, but he was still doing some interesting things.
Hmm.
And most even people that consider themselves more than casual Beatle fans, Beatle fans are pretty serious Beatle fans. They get wrong almost all the time is Brian Epstein's business acumen.
Hmm.
The short story is that Brian lost the Beatles millions and he was horrible at business. That is bullshit.
Hmm.
That is absolute horseshit. And that's one of the things that I mean everybody makes mistakes in business, and it's easy to play money quarterback and say, "Oh, you screwed this up" or whatever. And it's just that certain writers focused on these things and they just took a life of their own with turning a blind eye to all the incredible things the guy did and his loyalty, which is not very in the music industry. It doesn't
Right,
even barely exist.
right.
So he really does he deserves a lot more credit than he's given. And so I think those are some things that it would be nice to get a little more factual evidence on to weigh it, instead of just
Hmm.
saying, he was terrible, at business, which is kind of silly when you consider the Beatles' success.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe Lewison will be able to shed some more light on that when his books come out because he's the guy who has the resources
Mm-hmm.
and the means to really give us that kind of clarification to a large extent.
Yeah, one of the things he did uncover in his first book, Tune In, was that the Beatles would have broken up if it wasn't for Brian Epstein coming into the picture at that time.
Hmm.
We would have never heard of them.
Right.
And without Epstein, they never would have got out of Liverpool.
Hmm.
And they had no way of doing that. So the work he did in those formative years, and he put out a lot of money, and he worked hard for them,
Oh
and
yeah.
it took a while, but he obviously paid off. But yeah, I'm a fan of Epstein and how he handled the Beatles, because the way I look at the Beatles and the people that were connected to them, there's really two groups. There are people that really handled them with care and respect and love, and Epstein would be one of those.
Oh, sure.
And then there's people that wanted to get something from them, or they didn't bring much to the party. They were just hangers on, would be one classification, one group. Others that, um, that maybe marginally were bringing something, but ultimately they didn't make a difference. There's a lot of people that came in. You can imagine the people that would want something from somebody that popular and they generate that much money. So it's hard to trust people. How do you trust people?
As you were talking, I was thinking about Dick James, with the whole selling of Northern songs. And that I mean, I know John certainly considered him little more than than a hanger-on. What did he do? We're producing all the songs. What does this guy do? And he owns it. I mean,
Yeah.
insane. So yeah, I mean that would be one of those names that I could think of.
Yeah, the publishing world, it's a little confusing actually, but in
Yeah,
those days, I think, in hindsight, the Beatles probably could have started their own publishing company had they, but they had no idea that
right.
they could even write songs that would be generate that kind of popularity. If in hindsight, Epstein could have maybe set up a publishing with the Beatles and they could have published their own material. And then once it took off, well, then you're totally set. But who would have known?
I mean, I think eventually they would have gotten there. It's just a shame that that Brian wasn't there the last few years, and that B, there was just so much going on, and again, so much, pardon my French, dick waving between
Hmm.
Alan Klein and John shooting off his mouth and pissing off the board of NEMS and all that stuff that just all those deals that fell apart, where they could have gotten control of their own destinies in terms of the publishing. It's just, but Paul obviously, as soon as he was free of the Beatles, did exactly what they should have done, years earlier. And so he had learned his lesson. I suspect that, I know that with Yoko, John had Lenono music, which I guess it was a similar thing. Um,
Yeah, I don't know how
but
that was set up,
yeah, me
but
neither.
yeah,
But MPL, or what became MPL, was exactly what Paul knew he'd missed out on when the Beatles lost Northern Songs.
yeah, yeah. The Beatles certainly learned about publishing, and they learned the
The
hard
hard
way.
way.
But
Yeah,
if it wasn't for them, they probably would not have. Publishing would be different today. It
yeah,
would just still be more so in the hands of the Dick James types
right,
instead of
right,
the artists. And the
right.
Beatles really paved the way for artists to get more of a share of their publishing. Not in every
Sure.
case, but in many cases.
I mean, that's kind of, I mean, I actually thought about, maybe getting into a little bit of this stuff in the trivia book, but I was like, you'd have to go so deep in the weeds and to explain all of that in like 150 words, which
Mhm.
is what the answers basically are. It's like, steer clear of that.
Yeah.
Get into the more fun stuff.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, you've got a couple of years here to do the Ringo at 90. Are we going to see that, do you think? Poor Ringo doesn't get anything written about him.
I think it's safe to say that there probably will be a Ringo one,
Oh,
um,
good.
yeah, especially for his 90th. But yeah, and I mean, I'd like to think that I'd be the first person they call to do it.
Yeah, Ringo is just one of those guys. He's fun, and
Yeah,
he's never taken himself too seriously.
right. Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to see some of the what somebody would write about that because I'm sure you could do a really good trivia book on Ringo, and a lot of us wouldn't know half of it probably.
For this book, I did actually learn a couple of new things about Ringo. And the one that I'm working on now, I'm doing a little bit of a deep dive into him, and he does emerge as a really, not just a lovable but a likable figure. Just because he's not coming at it from an ego standpoint. I mean, I'm sure he has an ego. I mean, how could you not? You're the
Yeah.
drummer for the Beatles. But relatively speaking, within that world, he just emerges as, you know, he's the one who really has his head on his shoulders, you know. And yeah, I think it would be fun to explore him and give him his due.
Yeah, and since he got sober in well, I guess was the late 80s,
Late
roughly
80s, yeah.
30 years, he really that's quite an accomplishment for anybody to do and to
Hmm.
maintain because they say they're always in recovery. But
Yeah.
for him to be it's hard to be in the industry and there's a lot of temptations and stuff. But obviously he was older
Hmm.
and he got his life back and he did something probably very special with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I seem to remember him talking about it at the time, and it was jeopardizing his marriage. And they seem to have a great relationship, Ringo and Barbara Bach. And if you're in a good marriage, I would imagine that you would do everything humanly possible to keep it. And it's a real testament to the strength of their marriage that they're still married all these years later, and they weathered they weathered that storm, and it's great. It's a real triumphant story.
Yeah, I think the thing that helped keep them together, or they grew together. I think they went through the alcohol treatment together.
Mhm.
So they both, so that's kind of good. So if one can drink and one can't, obviously that's going to be a problem. And I know
Exactly.
Ringo
Yeah.
hangs out with a lot of guys. Like obviously he's the brother-in-law of Joe Walsh, who's also cleaned up
Right.
his act and has been sober
Exactly.
now for many years. And
Yeah.
so it's easier to hang out with guys that are in that same situation. And I guess there's a lot of musicians who qualify for that. But
Yeah.
hey, they made it. They came out on the other end and got their lives back, and that's really something special.
Yeah, they could have easily been one of those, stereotypical rock casualties, and would have hated to have seen Ringo end up like that. He's got a really good story, and so yeah, I have to imagine that there would be a similar. Ringo would get a similar treatment as he gets to his big birthday.
Yeah, he's a guy that he's still fun to. I don't buy his new music, but
Right.
I listen to the songs and it's just fun.
Hmm.
And it's not to be taken too seriously. And
Right.
I suppose sometimes he probably wants to be taken seriously, but
For sure.
he's loved, and I guess that seems to be good enough for him.
Well, that's the other thing is he's got a very deep Rolodex. Everybody loves him, and when you think about the it just runs the gamut of the rock gods who love Ringo, the people that he's hung out with. I mean, I would love to have been, just sort of like in the background watching him hanging out with Keith Moon. That must have been something to see, you
You
know.
know, a rock star in the 70s, it's just, I mean, the decadence, it's just
Mhm.
probably unparalleled. I'm sure it's paralleled, but with just different things. But
Sure.
with the Lear jets and the platform shoes and the wide colors, it just seems so outrageous.
And just piles and piles of coke just all
Yeah.
over the place, just debauchery, yeah, it would have been very interesting, and especially someone like Keith Moon who just dove nose first into it all, and Ringo was just there at his side for some of it. It was pretty intense. There's some great stories there that I would love to uncover.
Yeah, we had some dog problems here that occasionally happen.
Is that the dog during one of I think for your David Crosby video, the dog that jumped up on your
Oh
lap?
yeah, that's Bogey. That's
He's great.
that's Bogartis. Yeah, he I wasn't expecting that. So I wanted to do a quick video
Yeah,
and I did it in a different part of the house and he jumped up just
yeah.
like he was paying tribute to David Crosby.
Oh, it was adorable. I loved it.
So yeah, he's down 2 floors down barking his head off right now
Oh,
and
okay.
but you can still hear him.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so we lost another one, David Crosby. He's a guy that my buddy Paul and I, who's a big music fan, we listened to music together for the last 30 some years. And with David Crosby, it was always a joke. Like, he's still living. How can he be living still? He's
Yeah.
another one that got cleaned up in the 80s, actually. So that's really, he almost didn't make it.
Right.
And so I was very happy that we had him for that long because he was always entertaining and he's did a lot of new music in the last 10, 15 years too.
And his voice remained pretty much intact. I mean, he always had an incredible voice. And the last that I heard just a couple of years ago, I mean, it was still very strong, his voice, which was amazing. I mean, I remember going to see CSNY in 2000, and he sounded the best. It was, and you're looking at him like he should have been dead 15 years ago, and he sounded great.
Yeah. Yeah, his voice always was very strong, and I know he had diabetes, so he
Hmm.
kind of predicted that that was going to be what gets him, and he still lived to 82, 81, 82.
Hmm.
So I mean, that's still a pretty full life, and he came out of the dark ages there and really cleaned things up. So yeah, he and quite a legacy too, and quite a reputation too.
Yeah, it's the day after he died, I was having some fun. I mean, I posted him, like a little tribute to him on Facebook because I've
Mhm.
I've been a fan of CSN, CSNY, uh, the Birds, Buffalo Springfield, all that stuff, since my college days. And so I posted uh uh the tribute, the nice tribute, but then I
Mhm.
had to post the one, and I think you might have quoted this in your four-part series about the Birds, where a reporter asked, um, uh, their producer, the Birds producer, Doris Day's son. Why am I
Oh,
forgetting his
Terry
name?
Melcher.
Terry Melcher. Who's the most undesirable person you ever worked with? And without hesitation, he said David Crosby. And the reporter was taken aback and said, "Whoa, okay. Well, who's the second most undesirable person?" And Terry Melcher said Charles Manson. And I was
Exactly.
like, I have to post this.
Yeah, Crosby, I've read his biography and he's pretty honest about his
Yeah,
the way he is
yeah,
and yeah, he was difficult.
yeah.
And in fact, there was even a Beatle connection with Crosby. So on the 66 tour when the Beatles were in the States here, they must have been in Los Angeles and David Crosby met them and he's at the press conference with the Beatles.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think there was one, it must have been one of those conferences, and this didn't get recorded that I'm aware of, but they're asking David Crosby questions. He's like, don't ask me any questions. I'm not here representing the Birds in any way. Just really let the guy have it. He's
Yeah.
just being David Crosby. And, he
And he was
was,
that way up until like a couple of weeks ago. He was really persnickety with interviewers. I heard an interview within the last year where he just made mincemeat of the guy,
oh, did he really?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Um and this was fairly recently. So yeah, he was consistent. You got to
Mm-hmm.
say that. And the thing that cracks me up is, it's you've heard so many people say that about David Crosby, but David Crosby insists that the biggest asshole in rock music was Mike Love. So it's like
Oh, oh my God.
it's like, boy, I'd love to see those two like sort of duke it out for that title.
Yeah, well, I think Ted Nugent might have been in there as well.
Oh, for
There's
sure.
yeah, but Crosby, there was that documentary on him about 3 years ago, maybe four. I forget what it was called. I didn't go
Remember My
see it.
Name.
Is that what it was called?
I think it's
Yeah,
called
it was
Remember
a,
My Name.
a
And
limited release, and I happened to
mhm.
be at a theater where it was playing. I was seeing a different movie, but I thought it was interesting because the promo, the trailer for it, and he was saying how nobody in my former bands will talk to me.
Right.
Nobody. But that's
Yeah.
not true. I mean, he was kind of posing for the cameras there because Roger McGuinn of the Bird says, yeah, I'll talk to him. Of course I'll talk to him. And then Chris Hillman says, I love that guy dearly. So it's
Wow.
not, he's even, he's kind of makes more adversaries maybe than he has to, but it was surprising that him and Graham Nash finally fell out.
Well, that's that probably might have been what was on his mind when he said that, because I remember seeing an interview with Graham. Boy, we're really drifting off topic, aren't we?
Yeah.
But I remember seeing an interview with Graham Nash, and this was when Crosby went in for his surgery, when he was getting the transplant, the new transplant. What was it? A kidney transplant?
Might have
Or was
been
it a
liver or
liver?
kidney. I can't remember
Liver or
which.
kidney?
It wasn't personality.
And as he was on the gurney, they were taking him into surgery. Graham Nash was there, and he said to him, "You better make it through because you're not effing leaving me alone with Stills." Okay, that's how close they were.
Yeah.
Stills was the bad guy back then. So,
Yeah.
so for Nash to fall out with him finally, it was like, wow, what did he do to lose Nash? But he
Yeah.
managed to do it.
Yeah, he did. And
So,
I just saw something just today, I think just before we got on this call, I saw a tweet or something that maybe it was a YouTube video somebody did on maybe Nash had made peace with him before or something. But
oh,
I
okay,
don't know. I always, whether he did or didn't, I thought that Nash was really in Crosby's corner for such a long
he
time
was, he
that
was.
it doesn't maybe matter too much to me that they fell out at the end. Maybe it had to happen because
Mhm.
they really were tight for a long time, and Nash supported him, and I'm sure they supported each other. I'll just never forget one of the best concerts I saw was it was in '86, so it was the year that Crosby got back on the road again
Right.
after his incarceration.
Yep.
And just to see Nash, how he was so proud of David Crosby for coming clean.
Yeah.
And, but, like a lot of, like some alcoholics, dry alcoholics, they still can, they may have left the drug behind,
Right.
but they're still can have some of the tendencies of some of the drug, it's, I don't know.
Or it was never really the drugs to begin with.
Could be. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe the drugs just exacerbated what was already there.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was sad. I mean, it was sad to get that news that he was gone. It was surprising that he had made it this far. But more sad was just the fact that most of the people that he had worked with over the years were pissed off at him right up until his dying day.
Yeah, yeah. I think they like the CSNY guys. They loved him. Like Neil Young had a very nice, respectful send off.
Yeah.
Said how much Crosby meant to him in the old days, and helped him out and everything.
Right. Right.
So I mean, there's all that. I mean, these are long lives, and there's a lot of good. There's bad, obviously, but there's a lot of good. And
Hmm.
they were the biggest band in the world for a while there. After the Beatles, in 1970, the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were the biggest touring band in the world. So they hit it big. And it's interesting to see how the solo years were. Well, they had their solo stuff going on concurrently with the group stuff all through the decade of the 70s, which is really interesting.
You just made me think of a question I should have put into the trivia book, which was true or false. Crosby, Stills, and Nash auditioned for Apple Records and were rejected.
That's correct. They did. You know, what's so funny is how big of a joke Apple was as far as signing artists. I mean, they signed a couple, and just out of just not luck, but it was Peter Asher that really brought in James Taylor.
Yep.
And George Harrison was the guy. From what I remember, Nash saying they did their thing in front of George Harrison, and Harrison's like, "No way."
It's
You
funny,
know,
but yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say the irony of the singer-songwriter era that was really, well, maybe invented by the Beatles at the White Album stage, but the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young made it into a huge thing.
Yeah.
And that's what Harrison tried to become, and he couldn't quite do it. And the band he said no to are the ones that became the biggest singer-songwriters of all time.
It's funny because about 3 or 4 years ago, Graham Nash was on the Howard Stern show,
Hmm.
and he told that story. He told in
Did he?
detail the story about auditioning. They basically performed the whole album. They had the whole album written, that first CSN album, and they performed it in front as an audition for George Harrison, and turned them down. About 2 or 3 weeks later, Paul McCartney is a guest on the Howard Stern show, and Howard tells Paul the story that Graham Nash told Howard. And he says, and George Harrison turned down CSN. And Paul just kind of sat back and went, well, he was a great judge, wasn't he?
Yeah. Well, Harrison, he had no, look at the people he signed to like his Dark Horse label, all these like obscure people. I mean, he wasn't interested. He didn't like Elton John. He did not like David Bowie. He didn't like anybody. He doesn't like
Right.
Neil Young's guitar playing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, dude, what do you like? He
Jackie
didn't like much of
Lomax.
anything. Jackie Lomax
Jackie
and
Lomax.
some of his buddies he hung with, like Billy
Yeah.
Preston and some of those guys.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, he was really, it's too bad. I mean, it's so good for Crosby, Stills, Nash that they got turned down by Harrison because they went to Atlantic. Had
Right.
they gotten mixed up with the Beatles, the mess, they could have been another Badfinger.
They could have been another bad thing, or they also could have been another James Taylor who basically lost his first album. He couldn't do anything with his first album. I still don't think he can release his first album. He can.
I don't know. I don't
and,
know about that. Yeah.
And he had to re-record Carolina on My Mind because he couldn't for his greatest hits album, because he couldn't get the original version, which
Yes.
Paul McCartney played on.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, he had to re-record it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a mess. Such a mess. But yeah, I mean, the CSNY story we talk about, the Beatles breakup. What's funny is that CSNY, they never were really together. I mean, the name, they didn't have a band name for the purposes of being able to split apart easily because they all came out of bands
Right.
and they had to sue to, get their share and all that kind of thing. And if you trace the CSNY catalog from roughly 69, that first album, and Neil Young's first album, through the end of the 70s, it's just comical how
Mm.
they were always crossing paths and always saying they'll never work with one another again and get their back working, and they
Yeah.
just couldn't stay away from each other. It's
Yeah.
just really interesting how the music and how the success just pulls you back.
Yeah, it's and I do want to mention, since we're talking about all of this, as I alluded to before, I had watched your entire series on the birds, and I
Oh, you
learned
did.
so much because my knowledge of the birds, and for the longest time my interest in the birds kind of ends after they kick David Crosby out of the band. But you really sort of opened my eyes in terms of, well, there's a lot of really worthy material after that I really should seek out, which I never did before.
Well, thanks for mentioning that. That was a passion of mine to do that series, and because I love the birds, and I too, when I my earlier days, I wouldn't listen to the birds after the Notorious Bird Brothers, which is early '68. That's just
Mm.
before the country album. I didn't like country. I'm still not a big country fan at all.
Me neither. Me neither.
But the later birds, I had to grow and mature into a little bit. It's a little bit. It's harder to listen to because you have to do a little digging for the good cuts, unless you grew up with the album really
Right.
spinning a lot, which endears you to, if it's a part of your life. And it wasn't the case for me. So yeah, I think a lot of people tuned out of the birds after Crosby left
Mhm.
and went in these different directions that wasn't bird sounding. And that's very common. But there's a lot of fans from the later era as well. I think finally people are starting to bridge the gap and start to, look into some of these other songs. And it's an interesting, fascinating story. And they've got some very good music throughout those last couple of years as well.
Yeah, that was a great run of episodes. I just wanted to mention it because I learned something from it, and
Well,
my eyes were open.
well, like you had mentioned, you learned something from doing your trivia Beatle book here.
Yeah.
I learned something every time I put these videos together because I force myself to really get it right and lay the chronology out properly. And
Yeah.
some things I do find all kinds of things I didn't really realize that was going on. And that's really, really the fun of it for me. And then just bring it all together and seeing the final product. So I really enjoy doing that, even though it's a little bit time consuming, but I still
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah, I hear you, but I mean, with each one of these of these books that I've done about the Beatles in particular, I've learned something. Even if the general subject is something that I knew a lot about, there'll be like a little nugget that'll open my eyes.
Mhm.
Or like, like for example, I didn't know that George Harrison ended up owning He's So Fine.
Yeah.
I knew that it was in litigation for 25 years or where. I didn't know what that final twist of an outcome was. The last twist that I knew of was that Alan Klein had swept in and gotten the rights to it, in the
Hmm.
aftermath of him being fired as the Beatles manager. So little things like that. Uh it's always fun. The thing that kills me is when I learn this stuff right after I finish the book,
Yeah.
and it's too late to it's too late. There were some really great little tidbits that I'd learned about John right after I finished writing the John book. and
Mm.
and there were a couple of things that I found about Paul right after I finished the Paul book. And I, like I just said, like 5 minutes ago, I came up with a question that, boy, I would have loved to have put in there about CSN auditioning for Apple.
Yeah.
um but that's part of the fun process, is to learn all this new stuff.
Yeah, Mark Lewison has said the same thing. The
Oh,
second he
sure.
got his book done, something else pops up. Oh, here's the concert date I spent how long looking for, and now I figured it out and I got it wrong. Those
Hmm.
things are going to happen,
Yeah.
and the history gets the writing of the history goes on,
I'm at the point now where when I do go back and use my own Beatles library, those books, the Philip Norman books, or the
Hmm.
Stephen Gaines books, or the even the Beatles Encyclopedia by Bill Harry.
Yeah.
I have to look at it with kind of not jaundiced eyes, but skeptical eyes, because we know so much more now than we did back then.
Yeah. And these guys didn't have, I mean, there's no internet. So there's a lot of things that it's harder to do a really solid job when you have less resources and it takes you longer. And people get angry that like Lewison's taken 10 years per volume on this, but that's what it takes to do it, that kind of a job. There are writers out there that have done biographies a lot more quickly, and some of them are not very good because maybe they're just not researched enough. You
Right.
can only do so much research in 1 year. I mean, it's not a long time. It takes years. And the people that write books after only a few years, I'm finding that some of the best Beatle books are more not overall biographies, but they're specific to a topic. Like Joe Gooden did that book on Beatles drug use called
Hmm.
Riding So High. I
Right.
thought that was an excellent book. There's no other book that covers all that information anywhere near the way he does. But that's the value you get of focusing in on that. Or like Andy Bubuke's book on the Beatles gear. That I don't know if you've read that book. It's a book on all the Beatles guitars and drums and things.
No.
That book came out, oh boy, about 15 years ago. I was really impressed with that book. I thought, wow, this is something, and you would find, even if you're not a player, people would find it entertaining.
Hmm.
And it's just written so well. And there's all these receipts and all this stuff that really fleshes out the story. And it was really fascinating.
Well, I just got my hands on. It was given to me as a gift for the holidays. Was the new McCartney book about the solo years that,
Oh
that
yeah.
take you up to was it I think 73. I
Yes.
think it's from 69 to 73.
Mhm.
I haven't like sat down and read it chronologically, but I've been sort of like picking and choosing, going from area to area, and it's so far it's great. And the cool thing is, so far it just reaffirms the stuff that I did in my book. So I feel good. It's like, okay, I didn't get anything wrong yet.
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
least as far as I can tell, I didn't get anything wrong. So, whew, so that always makes me feel good.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what more we get on the Beatles here as things kind of wind down. I mean, obviously, we're going to start losing all these old rock stars are starting to pass on, and it's
Yeah.
just inevitable. And this year is probably going to have a couple others go too. Jeff Beck was a big surprise to me.
Yeah.
I didn't really expect that one,
Hmm.
but we can't take him with us. Let's close this up by telling people about where they can get the new bookazine, the trivia book of the Beatles, and because it's out now, right?
It is out now. Yes. In fact, people have been sending me photographs of them buying it at Barnes Nobel, which
Oh,
is one
very
of the
good.
places you can get it, or at the supermarket. You can order it directly from the publisher at magazineshop.us. Just type in Beatles Trivia and it'll come up. And yeah, like I said, Barnes and Noble. I think you could probably get it at pharmacies, supermarkets, wherever they sell these kinds of bookazines. Just
Hmm.
look for the trivia book of the Beatles.
Well, very good. I'll put some links down below so people can click on it very easily so they can
Great.
get their copy if they don't see it in getting their milk and eggs in the grocery store.
Or
Um,
their drugs
yeah,
at the drugstore.
yeah, exactly. All right, Glenn. Well, very good. And I know you're busy working on other Beatles stuff, so I'd love to have you back. The last reason I wanted to have you back this time, I mean, people like you the first time, so I'm going to keep bringing you back.
Terrific. This is a joy. I watch your videos almost every day, so it's a thrill to be here.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I know. Glad to know somebody's watching them. Makes my day. All right. Thanks, Glenn. You take care.
You too. Thank you very much.